My aunt claimed, "Your mom promised it all to me." So I found the handwritten letters from my mom saying the exact opposite and had her share taken away. I thought I'd had my fair share of family drama. Growing up with my mom and younger brother Alex in Oak Park, we didn't have a lot, but we had each other. My mother, Sarah Montgomery, was our rock. She was the steady heartbeat of our little family, especially after my dad died in a car accident when I was just 16. I'd watched her scrape together every penny she could, just to make ends meet and keep our modest house in shape. It was our safe haven, our one constant in a world that felt too often unpredictable. The only other relative who was remotely involved in our lives was my Aunt Melanie. Aunt Mel was complicated. She was my mother's older sister, a former schoolteacher who had never married and lived alone in an old family home on the fancier side of town, across the river in North Riverside. I wouldn't say she was cold, but she always kept a certain emotional distance from us, especially from Mom. I never knew why, and honestly, I never questioned it until much later. Aunt Mel and Mom seemed like opposites in every way. Where Mom was warm, Aunt Mel was sharp. Where Mom was giving, Aunt Mel was, well, she kept a tally of everything she'd ever done for us. Still, nothing could have prepared me for what happened after my mom passed away. Mom's death was unexpected. One day she was with us, smiling over breakfast, and the next, she was gone. A stroke. They said it was quick, that she hadn't suffered, but I didn't know how to process it. One moment, she was my anchor, my safe place, and the next, she was a memory. Just like that. We were still in shock during the days leading up to her funeral. I moved around the house like a ghost, and Alex was no better. He mostly just sat on the couch, staring into space or scrolling his phone aimlessly, occasionally looking at me like I might have the answers to questions he couldn't even ask. The day of the wake, the house was full of people coming and going. Friends, neighbors, people I hadn't seen in years, all there to pay their respects. I barely had the energy to talk to them. I kept finding myself wandering back to the kitchen, filling teacups or rearranging platters of food, just to have something to do. And that's when Aunt Mel found me. She walked into the kitchen, her heels clicking on the tile, a figure of rigid dignity in her tailored black dress. She looked around, gave a curt nod, and then fixed her gaze on me. "Nadine, dear," she said in that familiar tone, half command, half lecture. "I need a word with you. Privately." Her voice had that cool edge to it, like she was used to having her way. Normally, I would have brushed it off, but this was the first time we'd spoken since the funeral arrangements, and something about her expression made me uneasy. I put down the tray I was holding and followed her out to the back porch. She stood there for a moment, looking out at the yard, hands clasped as if she was about to deliver a lesson. "Aunt Mel, what's this about?" I asked, trying to keep my tone polite. She turned to me with a serious look, the lines in her face deepening as she spoke. "I don't know how to put this delicately, Nadine, so I'll just be direct. Your mother and I had an understanding about the house." I blinked, taken aback. "An understanding?" "Yes," she said, and I could swear there was a glint in her eye, like she'd been waiting for this moment. "Sarah and I discussed it years ago. She knew I would eventually inherit the family home across the river, but she promised this house to me, as part of my inheritance." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Promised? To you?" I repeated, almost choking on the absurdity of it. She nodded, her face unflinching. "Yes, Nadine. She wanted you and Alex to have a chance to live freely, without the burden of maintaining a property. You two are young, you have your lives ahead of you. She trusted me to take care of the house." My mind was racing. This house, the house where Alex and I grew up, the one place that still felt like home, was ours. Mom hadn't said anything about a promise to Aunt Mel, let alone giving her the house. And burden? Who thought of a family home as a burden? "Aunt Mel," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "I don't know where you got that idea, but Mom never mentioned anything like that. Not to me, not to Alex." She looked at me with that patient, condescending smile, like I was a child who just didn't understand the way the world worked. "Of course she didn't, Nadine. She didn't want to burden you with such adult matters. But I was her sister. We had an understanding, and I trust you'll honor that now." I took a step back, trying to process her words. This was surreal. Here I was, barely holding it together, grieving my mother, and my aunt was telling me that the one thing I had left, the house, was hers. I couldn't believe it.
"Aunt Mel, I can't just take your word for this."
"Mom didn't put anything like that in writing. There's a will. It'll say what she wanted." Her face tightened. "A will is just a piece of paper, Nadine. Your mother's word was more binding than any legal document." I couldn't help myself. I let out a small, bitter laugh. "So you're saying you expect me to just hand over the house?" She looked at me with a mix of pity and irritation. "I'm not asking, Nadine. I'm reminding you of the agreement your mother and I had. It's only fair." "Fair?" I repeated, my voice rising. Fair would have been her telling us, not you swooping in right after her funeral and claiming everything she left for us. Aunt Mel's expression darkened. I would have expected a bit more gratitude, Nadine, after everything I've done for this family. I stared at her, my mind flashing back to all the times Aunt Mel had visited us, always with that air of superiority, always subtly reminding us of her own sacrifices I never once saw her make. Gratitude? I echoed, my voice trembling. For what, exactly? She straightened, her face a mask of icy indignation. For being here when your mother needed support, for offering stability when you two were children. I felt a surge of anger boiling up. You think that entitles you to our home? She pursed her lips, looking down at me like I was a petulant child. I think it entitles me to what was promised, Nadine. I opened my mouth to argue further, but just then, Alex walked out onto the porch. He looked between us, his brow furrowing. What's going on? He asked, glancing at me, sensing the tension. Before I could say anything, Aunt Mel spoke up. Alex, I was just explaining to Nadine about the arrangement your mother and I had regarding the house. Alex looked at me, confused. Arrangement? Yes, Alex, Aunt Mel said, her tone soothing, as if she were explaining to a student. Your mother and I had an agreement that I would take over this house if anything were to happen to her. It was meant to be mine. Alex glanced at me, bewildered. Is that true? I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper. No, Alex. Mom never told us anything about that. Aunt Mel's mouth pressed into a thin line. Well, just because she didn't tell you doesn't mean it isn't true. Some things are private, family matters. Alex shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to handle this. He'd always been the peacekeeper, but I could see the same hurt and confusion on his face that I felt. Aunt Mel, he said carefully, we're still processing Mom's death. Can we talk about this later? Maybe when we've had some time? She looked at him, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Frustration, maybe, or maybe even anger. But she quickly masked it with a thin smile. Of course, she said, her voice sugar-sweet. Take all the time you need. But I hope you'll both come to see that honoring your mother's wishes is more important than clinging to a house. And with that, she left, her heels clicking sharply against the porch steps. I stood there in silence, my hands shaking as Alex put a hand on my shoulder. What the hell was that? He murmured. I looked at him, barely holding back tears. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. I'll continue with the next part if you'd like, where the tension escalates further as Nadine discovers the letters that shed light on her mother's true wishes. Let me know if you'd like more or if there are specific elements you'd like to delve into further. After that confrontation, Aunt Mel's words lingered like a bad smell. Every corner of the house seemed haunted by the thought of her marching in and taking it over. I felt like I was letting Mom down just by not fighting harder, but I didn't even know where to begin. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on putting Mom's things in order, both to distract myself and to honor her memory. It was during one of these late-night organizing sessions, while going through an old wooden chest in her closet, that I remembered Mom's letters. She'd mentioned to me once, years ago, that she'd kept a stash of letters she'd written to Aunt Mel when they were young. Apparently, they'd been close before. Well, whatever had turned Aunt Mel into who she was now. With renewed purpose, I dug through the chest until I found a stack of worn, cream-colored envelopes, bound with a ribbon. They looked ancient, some of the ink fading, but they were all addressed to M. Maynard. Aunt Mel. My fingers trembled as I untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, exactly, maybe some sign that Aunt Mel had manipulated my mother, or a clue that would explain why she felt entitled to our home. I pored over each letter, feeling like I was reading pieces of Mom's soul. They were filled with stories of her struggles, her dreams, her love for me and Alex. And frustrations with Aunt Mel's endless demands. Finally, buried in the stack, I found it. A letter dated just after my dad had died. I'd been young, but I remember how hard those days were. Mom had taken a second job to keep us afloat, and apparently, Aunt Mel had started pushing her even then. The letter read. Dear Mel. I know you have always expected this house to fall to you one day, being the Maynard family property and all. But I've made my decision, and I hope you'll understand. Nadine and Alex need stability more than anyone else. They deserve to grow up with roots, not the uncertainty we faced. Please, respect my choice, this house belongs to them. I'm sorry if this upsets you, but as their mother, I have to do what I feel is right. The words were a revelation. She'd specifically said the house was meant for Alex and me. Aunt Mel had lied, plain and simple. Armed with the letter, I called Alex and told him to come over. He was as shocked as I was, his face a mixture of anger and relief. We agreed that Aunt Mel needed to know we wouldn't back down, and I decided I'd confront her, letter in hand. I texted Aunt Mel, asking her to meet us at the house that evening. When she arrived, I could tell from her smug expression that she thought she'd won. She stepped into the living room with her usual air of authority, barely glancing at the familiar surroundings. She'd always looked down on our house, like it was a shabby reminder of the life she'd escaped. Well, Nadine, I'm glad you came to your senses, she said with a thin smile. Have you had time to think things over? I stared at her for a moment, holding the letter behind my back. Yes, Aunt Mel. We have thought things over. And I found something you might want to see. Her eyes narrowed, but she tried to keep her expression neutral. Oh? I stepped forward and handed her the letter, watching her face closely as she read. At first, she looked confident, dismissive even. But as her eyes moved down the page, I saw her expression change. The color drained from her face, and her lips pressed together in a thin line. She glanced up at me, and for the first time, I saw something close to fear in her eyes. You went through her things? She stammered. I held my ground, my voice steady. Yes, Aunt Mel. I did. And I found Mom's words, in her own handwriting. She wanted this house for Alex and me. She was very clear. Aunt Mel's face twisted, anger quickly replacing the fear. This is just one letter, she spat. She might have changed her mind later. Alex stepped forward, his voice cold. She didn't. And you know it, Aunt Mel. You've been lying to us from the start. Her eyes darted between us, and I could see the gears turning in her head. She was calculating her next move, deciding whether to keep up the charade or back down. But something in her expression told me that she wasn't going to admit defeat easily. Nadine, Alex, she began, her tone suddenly saccharine, I know this is a difficult time for you. Emotions are running high, and I don't blame you for lashing out. But I'm your aunt. I've been there for you through so much. I clenched my fists, feeling the anger rise in me. Being there for us doesn't give you the right to lie and manipulate us. You came here, right after Mom's funeral, and tried to steal the only home we have left. How can you call yourself family? Her face flushed, and for a moment, I thought she might break. But then, her expression hardened, and she lifted her chin defiantly. You two are too young to understand, she hissed. This house is more than just walls and a roof. It's the Maynard legacy, and as the eldest, it's my responsibility to ensure it's preserved. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Preserved? Aunt Mel, you just want it for yourself. Don't pretend this is about some noble family legacy. You never cared about us or Mom. All you care about is control. She glared at me, her voice sharp. You'll regret this, Nadine. I have connections. I can make things very difficult for you. Alex stepped forward, standing tall. Try it, Aunt Mel. We're not afraid of you. For a moment, she looked like she might lunge at us, her face twisted with rage. But then, something in her eyes shifted, and she seemed to deflate. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her shoulders slumping. Fine, she muttered, her voice dripping with venom. But don't expect this to be the last you hear from me. With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Alex and I stood in silence, the tension finally breaking as we looked at each other, realizing we'd won. We didn't need Aunt Mel's approval or validation. We had Mom's words, her wishes, and her love. And that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Aunt Mel tried to intimidate us, sending legal threats and making veiled comments through extended family members. But we held firm. The will was clear, the letter was ironclad proof, and ultimately, Aunt Mel had no legal grounds to claim anything. But just when I thought she'd finally given up, she made one last attempt to hurt us. She tried to smear Mom's memory, claiming she'd been ungrateful and manipulative. She spread rumors among our extended family, painting herself as the victim of some grand betrayal. At first, her words stung. I hated that she was tarnishing Mom's reputation, even after her death. But then I realized something. Aunt Mel was powerless. All she had left were her bitter words, and as long as I held on to the truth, they couldn't touch me. Eventually, people stopped listening to her. Family members began to see her for who she really was, a lonely, resentful woman desperate for control. I didn't even have to defend Mom's honor. The truth spoke for itself. Months later, I stood in the backyard of our home, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known since before Mom's passing. The house was ours, just as she'd wanted. Aunt Mel had faded into the background, a shadow in our lives that no longer had any power over us. As I stood there, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, I felt Mom's presence, strong and reassuring. She had always wanted this for us, to be safe, to have a place to call home. And now, thanks to her courage and her love, we did. Alex joined me on the porch, and we shared a quiet smile, knowing that we'd finally found closure. Aunt Mel might have tried to tear us apart, but in the end, she only made us stronger. We were no longer bound by her bitterness or her lies. We were free.